Carl Jung's Red Book is not a theoretical treatise, it is the record of a descent. A lived journey through visions, symbols, confrontations, and dialogues with the figures that shaped his inner world. It stands as the foundation of Jung's later work, the anima, the shadow, the self, individuation. Nothing in his mature psychology exists without the roots planted in these early encounters. And among all the forces he met, none was as foundational, transformative, or destabilizing as the anima. The anima, Jung's inner feminine, did not appear as an idea or a concept. She appeared as a presence, a guide, a challenger, a seducer, a truth-teller, a mirror of everything he feared and everything he lacked. Understanding the anima is not optional if one wants to understand Jung. It is the door through which he passed to encounter the deeper layers of psyche. This short session focuses entirely on the anima, where she appears in the Red Book, how Jung experiences her, what she reveals and what she destroys, what he learns from her, and how her presence reshapes his entire psychological model. This is the first of 4 sessions. The next 3 will explore the other inner figures that emerged in Jung's visions: Philemon, Elijah, and Salome. Together they form a constellation, an inner family, that became the backbone of analytic psychology. But everything begins here, with the anima, the first voice, the first rupture, the first guide. Chapter 1: The Threshold. When Jung began the experiments that would later become the Red Book, he was standing at the edge of a personal and intellectual collapse. His break with Freud had shattered not only a friendship, but a worldview. The Enlightenment confidence that reason alone could command the unconscious began to crumble. He found himself drifting between visions, dreams, and waking images that overwhelmed his waking psyche. And so, instead of resisting, he surrendered, deliberately opening himself to the flood. It was during this fragile transition that the first traces of the anima appeared. At first, she was a whisper, a tone in his dreams, a presence without form. Jung writes that she came to him as a soul, a feminine figure who lived beyond the boundaries of his thought. She was the one who spoke before the others spoke. She was the first to meet him at the threshold, the place where consciousness begins to dissolve into the unknown. The anima does not arrive as comfort. She arrives as disturbance. She arrived in Jung's visions as a force that questioned every certainty. When he first sat to write what he saw, he entered a landscape of deserts, serpents, blood-red skies, and ancient voices. In the middle of this wilderness, the anima emerged like the echo of something he had lost long ago. She did not take a single fixed shape. Sometimes she was a young woman, sometimes a voice, sometimes a guide, sometimes a judge. Her identity was fluid because she mirrored Jung's unconscious, the shifting, ungraspable territory he was just beginning to explore. Her first task was simple: break his pride. Jung realized he had spent his life identifying with the rational masculine mind, the penetrating intellect, the stern father energy of European psychology. But the psyche is not ruled only by reason. The irrational, the symbolic, the intuitive, the emotional, the relational, all these lived on the other side, in the territory of the anima. And she came to remind him that he had silenced her for too long. The first encounters were disorienting. Jung would write a question, and she would answer it in a tone that felt older than he was. She spoke in paradoxes. She contradicted him. She challenged the seriousness of his intellect. She asked him to consider that truth is not always logical, that wisdom sometimes speaks in images, that the soul is not conquered by analysis, but encountered through surrender. This was the threshold. Jung had opened the door. The anima stepped through it. Chapter 2: The Guide of the Inner Desert. Once Jung accepted her presence, the anima became a constant companion in his imaginal world. Their conversations fill the pages of the Red Book. She instructs him, contradicts him, humbles him, pushes him further. She is both irritation and initiation. One of her first teachings is that feeling is not weakness. To Jung, trained as a scientist, The emotional and symbolic realms were suspect, too subjective, too unstable. But the Anima insisted on the opposite. She reminded him that the soul communicates through images, moods, and impressions long before reason arrives. And if one ignores those channels, the psyche becomes hostile. Her guidance forced Jung to rediscover the intelligence of intuition. Their dialogues had a strange rhythm. Jung would hesitate, asking for clarity, for order, for intellectual grounding. She would reply with metaphors, visions, mythic fragments. He once asked her what she wanted from him. Her answer was simple: follow me. Not understand me, not analyze me, but follow. Trust the path even when it makes no sense. Her guidance soon led Jung into the inner desert, an imaginal landscape where every illusion collapsed. In this desert, the Anima taught him the first law of the soul, that every human carries an inner polarity. No man is purely masculine, no woman purely feminine. Each person is a dialogue between the two, and the unity of these opposites is the beginning of inner freedom. But the Anima was not only guiding him toward insight, she also forced him to confront his shadow. She exposed his arrogance, his desire for control, his dependence on intellectual authority. She showed him the cruelty he committed against himself by silencing the intuitive side. She confronted him with emotions he had repressed for years: fear, tenderness, longing, vulnerability. These confrontations were not comfortable. Jung wrote that the Anima sometimes appeared as a destructive force, tearing down his illusions. She reminded him that true initiation requires loss, that the old identity must crumble before a new one can emerge. In her presence, Jung learned to let go of certainty, to stand naked before the unknown, to admit that the psyche is larger than the ego. Her second great teaching was the relational nature of the soul. She taught Jung that no one reaches wholeness alone. The unconscious is not a personal diary, but a living field populated by autonomous figures. To understand oneself, one must learn to speak with these figures, to build a relationship with them. The Anima was the first to demand this relationship, and she set the pattern for all the figures that would follow: Elijah, Salome, Philemon. Through her, Jung discovered that the psyche is a world with its own laws, its own geography, its own inhabitants, and one must learn its language if one wishes to navigate it. Chapter 3: The Price of Initiation. The Anima is not a gentle guide. She destroys as much as she reveals. Jung paid a price for following her. The first loss was social. His colleagues whispered that he had lost his mind. A respected professor exploring visions and speaking with inner figures. This was academic suicide. Following the Anima pushed him out of the intellectual circle he had once thrived in. But he accepted the exile. He wrote that truth is often found outside the walls of institutions. The second loss was psychological stability. The Anima opened doors he could not easily close. Night after night, Jung faced overwhelming visions: rivers of blood, cosmic serpents, ancient kings, divine storms. The Anima asked him to trust the process even when it threatened to tear him apart. She was the one pushing him deeper, insisting that he not turn away. And Jung felt the strain. He admitted that he stood on the edge of psychosis more than once, but he also knew that stopping the work would fragment him even more. The Anima also stripped him of his intellectual armor. She demanded emotional truth. She demanded humility. She demanded that he face the parts of himself he preferred to hide, the insecure parts, the dependent parts, the wounded child he had buried under decades of discipline. She exposed his fear of being wrong, his hunger for recognition, his longing for connection. She forced him to feel what he had convinced himself he had mastered, but the deepest loss was identity. Jung realized that the man he thought he was, analyst, scientist, disciplined rationalist, was incomplete. The Anima broke that persona from within. She asked him to stand without labels, without theories, without the pride of knowledge. She taught him that the soul asks for authenticity, not brilliance, and authenticity requires the death of false identities. Yet the dangers of the anima extended beyond personal loss. Jung observed that the anima can mislead, seduce, distort. She is not always a benevolent figure. Sometimes she represents emotional storms, irrational impulses, projections onto others. Jung warned that without consciousness, the anima becomes chaos. She becomes obsession, romantic fantasy, or destructive longing. She can consume a person if they mistake her symbolic presence for literal fulfillment. Jung survived because he kept his dialogue with her conscious. He wrote down every vision. He questioned her when necessary. He resisted the temptation to idealize her. And through that disciplined engagement, the anima transformed from a destabilizing force into a teacher. The losses were real, but the gains were greater. For in losing his old identity, Jung found a new one, the one that would build the psychology he is known for today. Chapter 4: The Anima as Mirror. Before the anima could become a bridge, she first became a mirror, one so precise, so unforgiving, and so luminous that Jung could not escape what she showed him if the earlier stages of their encounter tore down his illusions. This stage forced him to confront the foundations on which he had built his life. The anima did not only challenge him, she revealed him to himself. One of the Anima's most persistent lessons was that the unconscious is not an enemy. For years, Jung had treated it as a reservoir of disturbances, fantasies, impulses, something to be managed and analyzed from a distance. But the anima insisted that the unconscious is a partner, a living counterpart that completes what consciousness cannot grasp. She confronted him with the limits of his daylight self. The logical mind could dissect, classify, and evaluate, but it could not feel its way into truth. It could not see itself, and so she became the instrument of inner vision. In this mirror, Jung saw the emotional life he had neglected. He noticed how much of his passion, longing, imagination, and vulnerability had been sealed away behind the mask of the scholar. The anima brought them back, not gently, but necessarily. She pushed him to recognize that a person who denies their emotional life is half-born, and that half-born people cling to certainty because they cannot bear complexity. Through her, Jung saw the extent to which he had trusted the mind at the expense of the heart. But the anima did not only reveal his wounds, she also reflected his potential. She showed him the images that live beneath the threshold of thought, ancient motifs, symbols older than culture, mythic forms that belonged to no individual, but to the collective life of humanity. These images did not come from textbooks. They rose from depths Jung had never entered before, and the anima insisted that he take them seriously. She taught him that the psyche contains a creative intelligence capable of expressing truths that reason cannot formulate, that symbols are not decorations, they are messages. At the same time, the anima revealed the personal dimension of Jung's shadow. She reflected his pride, his fear of chaos, his hunger for control. She showed him how these traits shape not only his theories but his relationships. Jung realized that he had often projected his own unacknowledged emotions onto others, especially women, burdening them with qualities he refused to own. The anima showed him how easily a man can mistake projection for destiny. She exposed the illusions that arise when a person sees through their desires instead of seeing reality. This stage of their encounter taught Jung the most humbling truth of his journey, that one cannot interpret the unconscious without surrendering to it. The anima demanded sincerity. She forced him to see that psychological insight is not a technique, but a transformation, and transformation begins with the courage to witness one's own contradictions without running away. In this mirror, Jung began to understand the nature of love, not romantic love, but the deeper, archetypal force that binds the psyche into wholeness. The anima's presence softened him. She taught him that true strength is not domination, but receptivity. That wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the integration of opposites, and that a person who cannot relate to their inner feminine will always relate poorly to the outer world. This was the turning point. For the first time, Jung no longer saw the anima as an intruder. He saw her as the reflection of his own soul. And through that reflection, he realized that the journey toward wholeness is, above all, a journey of honesty. Chapter 5: The birth of imagination. As Jung continued his descent, something unexpected began to happen. The Anima did not only reveal him to himself, she awakened in him a capacity that had been dormant since childhood, imagination as a mode of knowing. Not fantasy, not escapism, but a disciplined engagement with the images that rise from the soul's depth. The Anima taught Jung that imagination is not the opposite of reality. It is the gateway to a deeper layer of it. She showed him that the psyche speaks in pictures long before it speaks in words, and that these pictures are not inventions of the mind, but messages from the unconscious. Jung realized that imagination was not a regression into childishness. It was an initiation into adulthood of the spirit. Before the Anima, Jung considered imagination a secondary function, useful only for creativity or play, but she insisted that imagination is the bridge between the conscious world and the unknown. Through her, Jung entered the active imagination that would become one of his greatest contributions to psychology. In those visions, he learned to interact with the figures of the unconscious as living presences rather than symbols to be interpreted from afar. This was a radical shift. It meant that the unconscious was no longer a theoretical construct. It was a place, a landscape he could walk, a field he could explore, a realm where dialogue was possible. The Anima taught him how to enter that realm without losing himself to it. She warned him that imagination without grounding becomes delusion, and grounding without imagination becomes sterility. The task was balance. To allow the images to speak, but not to be consumed by them, to meet the unconscious halfway. In this process, Jung discovered that imagination has its own morality. When he approached it arrogantly, it resisted him. When he approached it humbly, it revealed itself. The Anima exposed this hidden law, that the soul protects itself from the unworthy, but opens to the sincere. Only those who enter without pretending, without controlling, without demanding, will be shown the truth. It was here, under her guidance, that Jung understood what myth truly is. Myth is not a primitive story or a cultural artifact. It is the natural language of the psyche. The Anima unveiled for him the symbols that appear across all ages and cultures. Serpents, trees, gods, deserts, oceans. Not as inventions, but as expressions of a universal inner reality. This realization reshaped Jung's understanding of humanity. He saw that the soul is older than the individual, that every person carries images that do not belong to them personally, but belong to the collective history of humankind. The Anima was the one who opened that door. She taught him that imagination is not a private dream, but a shared inheritance. As this faculty awakened, Jung began to understand why the ancient world treated imagination as sacred. He saw that the figures he met were not hallucinations, but archetypal presences, living patterns of the psyche. The Anima stood at the threshold of this inner world, not as a guardian, but as an initiator. She taught him how to enter, how to listen, and how to return. For Jung, this was one of the greatest gifts she offered, the revival of imagination, the restoration of the faculty that reconnects a person with the deeper currents of their own soul. Without this gift, he would never have met Philemon. Without this awakening, the Red Book would never have existed. Chapter 6. Integration: How the Anima Reshaped Jung's Life. After years of encounters, confrontations, and revelations, the Anima began to change her role. She was no longer merely the guide of the desert. She became the bridge, the connector between conscious and unconscious. Through her, Jung discovered the principles that shaped the rest of his life's work. The first lesson was the importance of inner dialogue. Jung realized that the psyche speaks in voices, not metaphorically, but literally in the realm of imagination. To ignore those voices is to cut oneself off from the deeper layers of being. To listen is to participate in one's own unfolding. The Anima taught him to treat these voices with respect, not as hallucinations, but as autonomous aspects of the self. The second lesson was symbolic thinking. The Anima revealed that the unconscious does not speak logically. It speaks in images, stories, myths. And these symbols are not dead, they are alive. They shape emotions, decisions, relationships. Through the Anima, Jung discovered the symbolic structure of the psyche. the mythopoetic dimension that influences every human life. The third lesson was emotional wholeness. The Anima forced Jung to integrate feeling into his life. He came to understand that reason without emotion is incomplete. That intuition without grounding becomes madness. The Anima taught him balance, how to unify masculine clarity with feminine depth, masculine structure with feminine flow. This became central to the idea of individuation. But the most important lesson was relationship. Jung learned that the quest for wholeness is not a solitary ascent, but a dialogue. One must learn to relate to the inner figures, to accept that the psyche is a community. And among all these figures, the Anima plays the role of mediator, connecting the personal self to the deeper collective layers of the unconscious. As integration progressed, the Anima prepared Jung for the arrival of another figure, Philemon. He would become Jung's inner wise man, his guide into higher understanding. But Philemon could not have appeared without the Anima clearing the ground first. She broke the walls. She softened the ego. She opened the channels of imagination. By the end of this phase of his life, Jung no longer saw the Anima as a mysterious stranger. He saw her as a fundamental part of his psyche, a lifelong companion, a mirror of his inner truth. And through her, he understood one of the central principles of psychological development, that no human being can achieve wholeness without integrating their inner opposite. Conclusion. The Anima is not just a feminine figure in Jung's visions. She is the doorway, the beginning of the journey. She represents the part of every person that is intuitive, emotional, relational, symbolic, imaginative. To encounter the Anima is to encounter the soul. Jung's descent into the unconscious began with her voice. She dismantled him and rebuilt him. She taught him to listen, to feel, to confront, to trust. And through her, he found the path toward individuation. This session has explored 4 dimensions of Jung's relationship with the Anima: her appearance at the threshold, her role as guide and challenger, the losses and dangers of following her, and the integration that transformed his life and psychology. The next sessions will explore the figures who continue this story: Philemon, Elijah, and Salome, each revealing new dimensions of Jung's inner world. Practical action. Spend 10 minutes this week paying attention to your inner responses, not your thoughts, but your intuitions, feelings, images, sudden insights, symbols that randomly appear in your mind. Notice them without judgment. Write them down. Treat them as if someone inside you is trying to speak. Because the psyche always speaks, and the Anima often speaks first. If you are to remember anything, remember this. The Anima is not a fantasy, not a metaphor, not an abstraction. She is the living bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. She is the first guide on the path of inner transformation. And understanding her is the key to understanding Jung and yourself.